Welcome to the EPG Pathshala's linguistics course and to the morphology and syntax paper that I am responsible for. I am Prabal Dasgupta. I work at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata. In this session, we shall cover module 30, which is about the grammar of complex predicates. As the name indicates, our objective is to introduce you to the grammar of complex predicates. To put it very simply, the compounds that are called compound verbs consist of two members which are both verbs, VV compounds. Complex predicates are compounds of the form noun verb, or in a minority of cases adjective verb, and in a very tiny minority of cases adverb verb or particle verb. Very few cases of that kind. The verbs that feature in these NV compounds, noun-verb compounds, the overwhelming majority involve noun-verb in the structure, are known as light verbs. Light verbs have in common with the vector verbs of a compound verb discussed in the preceding module the fact that they are semi-lexical, that they are halfway between auxiliary status, fully integrated into the grammar, and lexical status, completely outside the grammar as full lexical items. It turns out that English, surprisingly, also has complex predicates. So the comparative situation, comparing Indian languages with English, is not quite what it is in the case of compound verbs, where English doesn't have any compound verbs at all. Let's begin with examples of light verbs and of complex predicates from English. Compare the simple sentence 1AA, John offered concrete assistance to Bill, where offer is a simple verb, with the sentence substituting a complex predicate for the simple verb 1A. John made an offer of concrete assistance to Bill. You can perform dative shift on the verb with the simple verb, on the sentence with the simple verb. This is not surprising. So 1AA, John offered concrete assistance to Bill, comes out after dative shift as John offered Bill concrete assistance. You expect this, and that's what happened. You don't expect the complex predicate in 1A, John made an offer of concrete assistance to Bill, to undergo dative shift and give you John made Bill an offer of concrete assistance. This is surprising, because ordinarily the verb make does not sponsor dative shift. The verb make carrying this sense does not sponsor dative shift, but here you are seeing dative shift. There is reason to believe then that the dative shift property comes from the complex predicate as a whole, and that offer is making a contribution to it. Let us now move from English to an Indian language, in this case Bangla. Consider several examples from Bangla of complex predicate sentences. The first one is 2A. It means Ram will lend Shyam 3,000 rupees. It comes out as Ram Shyamke 3,000 taka dhar debe. Dhar debe, loan, will give, is the exact form of the complex predicate. In 2B, which means Yadu will no longer help Madhu, the exact form is Jodu Madhuke ar sahajjo korbe na. Here sahajjo, help, is a noun. Korbe na, won't do, is a light verb in the negative form. 2C, Deepen eshober কিছুই টের পায়নি, which means Deepen didn't notice any of all this, has the light verb পায়নি, didn't get, with the cranberry noun ter, which means perception. We will not take you through all the examples orally. You will find that there is always a light verb whose meaning may be make, do, be, become, give, take, fall, and so on, with a heavy constituent which is typically a noun. Sometimes it is other than a noun, but nearly all the time it's a noun. When we compare the set of light verbs in a language with the set of vector verbs in that language, we find an overlap. There are some verbs that function both as vectors in compound verbs and as light verbs in complex predicates. But the lists are different. There are always some vectors that cannot possibly be light verbs and some light verbs that cannot possibly be vectors. One of the facts about light verbs and vectors is that you often find vectors outside light verbs. Why? Because a compound verb construction which features a light verb, a compound verb construction which features a vector has a verb, a heavy verb as the first constituent of the VV construction, and that heavy verb is entitled to take the form of a complex predicate. So you get 3B, for example. Make sure that you Xerox the documents. Comes out as Dolilgulo Xerox kore now. Xerox kore is a complex predicate. Noun Xerox, light verb kore. So Xerox having done, Xerox kore, take now. So Xerox having done take is the gloss for Xerox kore now, where the light verb which takes part in forming the complex predicate precedes the vector which takes part in forming the compound verb. This is systematic and invariable. You always find a light verb inside and a vector verb outside, never the other way around. We have set an exercise for you asking you to explain why this is so. We trust that you will find this a simple exercise. How are we going to structure complex predicate constructions? Let us try tree number 4 for Ram will lend Sham 3,000 rupees, in which we show the word for loan, dhar, as the head noun of a noun phrase. Shamke 3,000 taka dhar, which literally means to Sham 3,000 rupee loan. This noun phrase then counts as the object of the light verb give. That is one hypothesis, that there is a transformation operating on such a deep structure, call it complex predicate formation. It takes the head noun dhar, loan, from that noun phrase, adjoins it to the light verb give. It performs adjunction as explained earlier. The result of adjunction is that that verb is doubled. So you get verb dominating dhar on the left, the noun, and debe on the right. If you've learnt about adjunction, you've also learnt about pruning. So taking the head noun out of your noun phrase results in that noun phrase not having a head anymore. It will of course be pruned. The result is that these object noun phrases shamke, to sham, and 3,000 taka, 3,000 rupees, now become daughters of the VP rather than daughters of this deleted NP. This is the syntactic structure you expect at the surface structure level. There is evidence for this analysis. Consider 5. তুমি ওকে কোনো টাকা ধার দেবে না, you won't lend him or her any money. This is a sentence containing the famous quantifier kono, any, and that kono can be moved to the right, giving you 6. Tomi oke taka dhar debe na kono. You to him or her money will not lend any. This shows that the complex predicate counts as a verb for the purposes of quantifier postposing. The difficulty with this way of handling the data is that we are now forced to say, for the purposes of quantifier postposing, compound verbs are also single V's. Thus, if you take 7, you won't prompt him or her with any answers. Tomi oke kono uttor bole debe na. Here also it is possible to move kono to the right, as shown in example 8. If you want to do that, you have to set up another transformation called compound verb formation. That involves getting rid of the volatile subject downstairs and dismantling the entire clause and pulling out the verb and putting it upstairs. That would be the logic to follow if the analysis we have provided for giving a loan is the optimal general analysis for all complex predicates. Is that the case? When you take another example, example 9, you find that it is very difficult to offer this as a general analysis. The meaning of 9 is Partho cannot recall Arundhati. It takes the form Partho genitive, Arundhati accusative marking, mind locative, is falling negative. Now that locative marked element mone, at one level a case inflected noun, actually crosses over from the noun category to some other category that you may either call adverb or preposition depending on your exact analysis. For our purposes it doesn't matter. If you don't like to call it a P, which means preposition or postposition, feel free to call it adverb. How do we know that it belongs to this other category? Well, P or adverb allow reduplication in general. This mone, mind locative, allows reduplication. You can say mone, meaning in your own mind without saying it out loud. Whereas real nouns carrying nominative, accusative or genitive marking do not permit reduplication. You cannot say mon, or monke, or moner. So the only rational explanation of the way sentence 9 functions is to have a prefabricated, preformed complex predicate with a V mother and a P V daughter, or an adverb V daughter if you prefer. We don't really care what you call the first constituent. Is present in the lexicon and is inserted directly into the verb slot of the sentence. This means that there is no scope for any complex predicate formation rule to create it transformationally. Once we have made the decision to generate some complex predicates in the lexicon and other complex predicates through a transformation such as was invoked in the case of the loan giving example, we have to also allow two ways of generating compound verbs, depending on the degree of whimsicality or idiosyncrasy. It's a matter of making case-for-case decisions, case-by-case decisions, and we cannot make this part of an elementary morphology and syntax course. We're just informing you that if you take the route of handling complex predicates through two different sources, you have to apply the same policy to compound verbs. The fact that we are now proposing a mixed analysis for complex predicates and also for compound verbs, where some examples are generated directly in the base and drawn from the lexicon, where the compound or complex predicate is prefabricated, and some cases are created in the transformational derivation. It is very likely that some of you will conclude that since transformations are systematic and a part of the grammar, they will deal with general facts and the lexicon is supposed to deal with special facts. Since cranberry words are special, surely they should be handled in the lexicon alone. There is no logical reason, however, to jump to that conclusion. We offer at Exhibit 10 a possible deep structure for the derivation of ter power to notice by applying the complex predicate formation rule that we proposed a while ago. Even though ter, perception, is a cranberry word, there is no logical reason to force ter power to notice into the lexicon simply because ter is a cranberry word. The rest of the reasoning we have offered to justify this type of structure for the case of dhardeva, to give a loan, applies point for point in the case of ter power to notice just as well as it does to dhardeva, to lend. In other words, there is no necessary correlation between the occurrence of cranberry words and the need to postulate a prefabricated lexical entry for an entire complex predicate or an entire compound verb. The two questions are distinct and need to be kept distinct. In exercise 2, we try to accustom you to the fact that a transformation has no idea whether one of the words it looks at is a cranberry word or not. Consequently, there is nothing to stop a transformation applying to a structure in which there is a cranberry word and modifying it. We understand, of course, why you must have jumped to the conclusion that if there are lexical specificities to describe, they should be described in the lexicon. You must have been thinking about our general convention from the morphology modules onwards, that when there are two competing mechanisms applicable to the same candidate, it is a methodological imperative to give priority to the more specific mechanism and to let the general mechanism take the back seat and come forward only if it has to. It must have occurred to you that transformations are a more general mechanism than lexical entries, and it must have therefore seemed that since cranberry words turn their neighborhood into something idiosyncratic, special, and specific, it might therefore be appropriate to compel the lexicon to express those facts and not leave them to the transformations which are general. If this is the reasoning that led you to the thought that transformations should not be used in order to come up with outcomes that include cranberry words, then we need you to look at the reasoning a lot more carefully. Notice that we don't know if this was your reasoning. We are merely addressing one section of the learners who may have followed this line of reasoning and may have arrived at this thought. We're not casting aspersions. We are trying to address a certain line of thinking in case it has occurred to you. In order for the general convention to apply, in order for it to be possible for users of a grammar to give priority to the more specific of two rules when two rules are equally applicable to a given candidate form, to make it possible for that to happen and to proceed optimally, it is necessary for those who write the rules to do the exact opposite of what we're encouraging users of rules to do. In other words, the creators of rules have to follow the opposite convention of the convention that the users of rules have to follow. Users of rule must users of rules must indeed pick the more specific of two rules and push the general rule aside until the specific rule has had a chance to try its luck and, if need be, fail. Only if the specific rule fails must the general rule be allowed to step in. In the other direction, when you're writing a grammar rather than using a grammar written by somebody else, it is your duty to provide as general a treatment as possible of the phenomena that you see. You must be prepared to write specific treatments rather than general treatments, but for you that should be a low priority. You should write a specific formulation for the facts that you see only as a last resort if all your efforts to write general formulations have failed. You see, if you did not follow this convention as a writer of grammatical rules and principles, then in your practices of grammatical rule writing, there would never be an opportunity for you to notice a generalization and state it as a maximally general rule. The moment you see a particular fact, you would be inclined to write an extremely narrow and specific grammatical rule recording that particular fact and saying, this is a rule, I'm finished with this piece of data, let me go on to the next piece of data. Then your grammar would turn into a dictionary, you see. This is not what you want to do. You want your dictionary to record specific facts, granted. In order for that to happen, you have to be able to distinguish the specific facts from the general facts. For that to be possible, you have to find the general facts. They don't wear their generality on their sleeve. You have to discover them. The only way for you as a writer of grammars to discover general facts is to keep exploring the data, noticing patterns, trying to find the maximally general patterns and trying to record them. At the same time, noticing all the peculiarities that torpedo these simplistic statements of the patterns. You need to keep all this in mind. And this means that you have to follow a convention giving priority to the general over the specific when you're writing a grammar. And that only when you are using a finished grammar can you follow the opposite convention that says give priority to the application of the specific rule over the application of the general rule. This is why it makes sense for transformations to derive as many compound verbs and as many complex predicates as possible, and to state as few complex predicate lexical entries and compound verb lexical entries in the lexicon as possible. That is why it is important not to allow the occurrence of cranberry words to influence your decision about whether a particular case should be handled by a general device such as a transformation or by a special statement in the lexicon. In the final section of this module, we are concerned with the application of recursive rules. In order to determine the extent of recursion that occurs in compound verbs and complex predicates, we need to find the largest possible compound verbs and complex predicates. The largest possible compound verb in Bangla that we have been able to find is nachiye niye berano, which means toy with the affections of, and which consists of one pole and two vectors. There are no known cases of three vectors attached to one pole. Among complex predicates, likewise, we find three-member compounds, such as go into hiding ga dhaka dewa, or help somebody across the street, rasta par korano. These are maximal and they have exactly the same length as the maximal compound verb we've been able to find. What is the syntactic structure of these constructions? The material that is most helpful in arriving at an answer to that question concerns the complex predicate rasta par karan. Rasta par karano, to help somebody across the street. If you take example 12, where this verb is instantiated, O ekhane niyomito andhoder rasta par kore, she regularly helps the blind across the street here. We have no empirical basis for placing andhoder and rasta, the blind and the street, under par, crossing. We also don't have a basis for placing andhoder rasta par under the verb korano. Therefore, we have no viable transformational derivation that brings us to 12 from a plausible deep structure. When we compare 12 with 13, the complex transitive predicate that means crossing the street, ekhane andhora niyomito rasta par hoy, blind people regularly cross the street here, we find that this 13 has a formally simple equivalent where instead of par hoy, cross become for the meaning cross. You get a single word in 14, ekhane andhora niyomito rasta peroi. Blind people regularly cross the street, as in languages like English, where there are very few or no complex predicates. We are forced to conclude that the simple transitive verb perono, to cross, has a complex predicate variant par hoa, cross become, which comes out as to cross, and that the causative par korano is based on it. These are lexical matters, and there is no neat syntactic generalization that applies to the lexical material. This means that we cannot answer the question as to the appropriate syntactic structure for three-member complex predicates on any general basis based on the empirical discussion that we have just concluded. So what we need to do is provide a template within which the lexical entries are to be fitted, and our question is whether 15a, with a verb mother having a left-hand daughter n and a right-hand verb daughter, which again breaks up into NV. In other words, a structure that you get from the recursive rule V is rewritten as NV, is the appropriate template, or whether we want to first form a noun-noun nominal compound on the left and put that with the verb without any recursion. Without any recursion for the verbal rule. Of course, there is recursion for the nominal compound rule, because the moment you write n, arrow, n, you can have lots of nouns nested in nominal compounds. We independently know that nominal compounds permit nesting, but that is not the issue here. The issue here is whether in Rastapar Korano, Rastapar is a nominal compound, and there is zero evidence for this. This is also true for Gardhakadeva. This is not a huge sample, so we don't have enough of an empirical basis for concluding definitely that 15a is the correct answer. But we hope to have convinced you that regardless of whether you keep recursion in the system of verbal expansions in the phrase structure rule for complex predicates and for compound verbs, the actual decisions will have to be made on a case-by-case basis with reference to lexical details. It is not possible to do it on a general theoretical basis. The general theory of syntax does not provide answers to questions like what is the appropriate structure for a 3-member complex predicate or for a 3-member compound verb. It's time to wrap up the module. In this 30th module of the Morphology and Syntax paper, we have gone into the details of the grammar of complex predicates. Initially, there was a slight hope that we might get some guidance from the grammar of English, because English happens to have complex predicates of its own, though on a limited scale. But it quickly turned out that we learn more from the analogy between compound verbs and complex predicates than from the grammar of English in this case. And we were able to again look at Cranberry words as a guide to the elucidation of the structure of complex predicates. We had an opportunity to consider the issue of whether the specificity of Cranberry words forces us to deal with Cranberry facts entirely in the lexicon. And we spent a large part of the discussion in this module showing that that was not the case. It is extremely important at this late stage of the paper to read the e-texts quite carefully, not only the e-text for module 30, but to review earlier e-texts so that your composite understanding of the entire paper improves now that you're nearly finished with the reading and the listening. Not only do you have to do these exercises, we would urge you to go back and repeat some of the earlier exercises to see if you have lost practice or if you have forgotten part of what you learned in the earlier parts of the course. It is perhaps slightly less important at this stage to do supplementary reading, but if you have been consistently doing the core reading provided by us and the supplementary reading to which we drew your attention in connection with the earlier modules, you should be in good shape by now. If you are not in good shape, perhaps you have some catching up to do. So at this stage, we invite you not only to provide feedback, if any, and to ask questions if you have any, but to actively seek any counsel that you might need in order to consolidate your understanding of morphology and syntax, because it is one of the key papers in a linguistics course. A linguist who hasn't learned adequate morphology and syntax will have enormous difficulty tackling the rest of linguistics. Thank you for your attention.